Thursday, January 19th, 2023. We're here for the meeting of the Charter Review Commission. Bob, do you know if the meeting's been properly warned?
I believe yes.
Thank you. So the meeting's been properly warned. We call the meeting to order. The first matter on the agenda is to approve the minutes. We have a motion to approve the minutes.
I move that we approve the minutes.
We have a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
I have one correction. My name is Isabel.
Okay.
And I emailed Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank Joy for reviewing those minutes. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed or abstaining? That carries 7-0. So the next matter on the agenda is to review the existing charter with the town attorney. So I think we'll just turn it over to the town attorney to walk us page by page through the charter. Anybody want to interrupt the town attorney while it's going on? Please do so.
I was just going to say exactly that. What I thought we would do is to go through the entire charter. Some of us are very, very familiar with it, some may not be, and it's not with the idea of making all the changes that we need to make, but more so to come away from tonight to understand there are some housekeeping things that I'll point out along the way that we just need to make note of that will be hopeful changes. But then with that as the backdrop, then the committee can really go to work on deciding what form of government you like. Do you like this form? Do you want to amend this in small ways, large ways? Doesn't matter to me, but I thought we'd just go through it. So if you have it in front of you, flip first to the table of contents. Hi. We started a minute early.
No, we started at 6 o'clock.
That's right. Would you like a copy just so you can read along with us?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think you're supposed to sign in. Sorry, Franz.
After you sat down, Franz, you gotta get up again.
Talk about sticking.
All right, so with the table, I thought I'd start with the table of contents, just to give you an overview of the different components of it. So the very first section is the preamble, gives a bit of the history. I'll get into that. Article 2 is really the organization, the different officers, the manner of election, representative town meeting, the select board, what was the school board, the various boards. Article 3 are really the powers of the people and how individual voters can seek initiatives, reconsideration, referendums, etc. I'm going very broadly over this, but we'll jump into it as we go. Article 4 goes into all of the powers of the select board. Article 5 goes over the powers, duties, etc. of the town manager. Article 6 deals with the powers and responsibilities of the school directors. Article 7 gets into all the finances. Article 8 describes the 4 ways to amend the charter. Article 9 are transitional. And then you'll see Addendum A, Acts of 1959, and that really is the basis and outline of representative town meetings. How the members are elected, nominated, what happens with a resignation, filling vacancies, voting, all of what goes into our representative town meeting. And then Addendum B are the rules of procedures. Addendum C are the descriptions of the various boards. I think there'll be some need for editing there. And then a glossary, which I think when we're entirely done, you should take the keywords and define all of them. But that's in one page, the summary. So, any questions, interruptions, anything so far? because feel free to interrupt. On the Article 1, the preamble, it starts that this is the charter is the legal governing document that governs the town of Brattleboro. And it gives somewhat of the history of it. And I would note, while it talks about adopting a charter in 1927 and in 1984, major revisions having been done, in my view, there's a whopping omission of what happened in 1959 when representative town meeting was created. So, to the extent that with the preamble and the history and the context of how our charter was formed, I think we may want to do some revisions there from a historical perspective. Not a huge deal, but the Acts of 1959 created the representative town meeting form of government, and to my knowledge, Brattleboro is the only town in the state that operates under this form of government.
I don't know if this request goes to David or maybe Jessica, who's gonna be watching this, but has everybody seen the town plan? And maybe we should get copies of it. Because one of the things says compliance with the town plan.
Okay.
And so I think that might be helpful.
I'll make a note of materials that we'd like to have accessible as resources.
It is on the town website if you want to go look at it. But sometimes it's helpful to have a paper copy.
Sure, yeah. Article 2 is the organization of town government. And with regard to the definitions, when we speak of general town meeting, we're really talking the first Tuesday in March for the annual voting. And then representative town meeting is the meeting of the members of representative town meeting who are elected. And that is usually the third Saturday in March. Also, you will note from time to time, if we talk about the voters, I many times will use the words voters at large, which would mean voters in a general election as compared to voters of the representative town meeting where members of representative town meeting vote. Because you'll note, and I'm jumping really to the addendum A, the representative town meeting will say all acts of the town government are done through the representative town meeting with several exceptions. So when we speak of, when you look at state statute for municipalities, and they talk about the voters, when you're talking about Brattleboro, you're really talking for, in most instances, representative town meeting members voting. So for anyone, it's a dichotomy that we have to just keep in mind as we move forward. So then, yeah.
Just a question about the reference to general town meeting. Do you know of a reason in state law why it would have to be worded this way as opposed to referring to it as an election that occurs on town meeting day to distinguish it more from representative town meeting?
That's a good, I'm not aware of any, I mean, in the statutes, when they talk about annual town meeting or general town meeting, they're really talking all the voters of the town.
Right.
For Brattleboro, I can't think of a meeting where all the voters of the town are getting together other than for voting.
Right.
So we could distinguish between voting and meeting, which would further distinguish the representative meeting from elections. So,
Thank you.
Section 2 of Article 2 goes through the elections. So you elect your representative town meeting members by district. 5 select board members, was 5 school directors. That will need to be amended. And I think somebody had a question last time, or maybe it came up during the week, with regard to what has changed with the schools. So it had been that every town had its own school district. And then with recent changes to state statute, it created unified union districts, so that with respect to Brattleboro, there is no longer a town school district. Brattleboro still has schools, but they're part of a unified union district. And since that law is a more recent and more specific law than our charter, that law controls over the charter for the time being. And I'll come back to that when we get to the school board section. But in large part, wherever we have items in here that talk about the school, that's going to need either to be eliminated or changed with language that might resurrect things in the event that future laws change. But we can talk about that. Then we have Union High School directors. That also has changed a bit. 3 listers, 3 trustees of public funds, and then moderator, first constable, second constable. I believe by statute, when we look at those elected officials, and I can go through this in more detail, but I'd like to take a look at the required elected officials that are provided by statute, which over the years has grown, and then compare that to what we have. They should be fairly similar. Okay? I'm sorry, I sometimes digress myself, but with regard to that, stating that the statute says one thing and our charter says another. There are many times where our charter mirrors exactly what is written in state statute. And in my view, there are probably more than 2 schools have thought on this, but at least 2 schools. One which says, if you are agreeing with what general state statute says, then why don't you just say, as per state statute, as may be amended from time to time. The other school of thought is, well, when people pick up the charter and they want to know how does Brattleboro really run, they want to read it here, and they don't necessarily want to be referred to different statutes and volume 17 of this and title 24 of that to find the answer. The downside of that, of course, is if the statute changes, you're in the position of perhaps having to change your charter more often. But that will be a recurring theme as you go through your process. Section 3 deals with the manner of election and early voting, and there have been some recent charter amendments. I say recent, the last, and that Cappy was, so it's more than 6 years ago, 7 years ago. But dealing with early voting there and the hours of voting, etc. I won't necessarily go too much in depth on that unless anyone has questions today. We will need to incorporate recent changes with regard to the youth vote, which have not been incorporated into it. So that's a note that I've made.
But that wasn't adopted by the legislature.
Not yet.
Right, but why would we put it in if it's
Right.
been?
No, but I thought it was up again at the legislature.
Right, but nothing's happened with it yet.
I know. Well, I'm just saying, we need to address it if the
Oh, I see.
legislature passes that.
What about mail voting?
Mail voting?
Yeah, voting by mail. Does that just come under early voting?
I believe that it's a combination, again, under early voting and Title 17, which is our statute on elections.
Hillary has indicated that she wants to submit some recommendations. And I also noted that mail voting is absent from this section, and the procedures are different, so probably that'll have to be added to the charter and updated.
Super, all right, I'll make that note too. Goes through the election of representative town meeting members by Australian ballot, various other offices by Australian ballot, first Tuesday in March, etc. So then it describes representative town meeting, and that makes reference, which we'll get to later in the addendum A, which are the provisions of representative town meeting. But note in section 4A there, that if there's a conflict between the main body of the charter and the addendum A, that the provisions of the main portion of the charter prevail. Once in a while, we run into a conflict there. Representative town meeting is 140 members. That is something, if you wish to keep representative town meeting as the form of government, that you may want to reconsider the number. And tonight, my idea is to just list ideas, make a note, and we'll come back to them, because any of these we can really get down into the details and the weeds on. But I think save that all for future meetings. But when you look at the different districts having to caucus in order to fill their seats to get up to 140 each year, it calls into question, well, maybe the 140 is too many representatives. Perhaps that should be lowered to a point where you get competitive races to be a representative. Just a question out there that I would note, okay? Section B of that goes into, under the current charter, ratifications that representative town meeting makes of various appointed officials. The town clerk, town treasurer, town attorney are always ratified by representative town meeting. Okay, at least there are articles for that at each town meeting. Section C deals with the description of the finance committee in town. One note that I have is whether that should be in this section or in other sections, more about where it fits best. The one problem that we run into many times at representative town meeting is the question of how do we set who's on the finance committee and how they're elected, because currently it reads, the representative town meeting shall fix and from time to time may alter the number of members, the manner of their selection, their terms of office, compensation, if any, duties and functions. So there's no, unlike other committees that give a set number of individuals on the committee, or whether they're elected or appointed, their terms of office, the finance committee is left fairly broad with respect to how it's written now. So I think there's some work to be done in defining that a bit better. Select board, as it currently sits, is with 5 persons. School board will need to eliminate that. There's section 7 talks about the library trustees. At another time, we can go into libraries and municipal government and authority over librarians, and the connection between the town and libraries is actually quite interesting. In Vermont, there are many different types of libraries and different boards of trustees. some of which are more autonomous than others from town government. But Section 7 describes how those 9 persons are elected. They each serve 3-year terms. And you'll see, those of you who've been in representative town meeting, every year we have an article to usually elect 3 to fill those. There's about 3 every year that on staggered terms. Any questions so far? We have a conflict of interest section, section 9 on page 4. That over the years has been a topic of conversation insofar as the what the charter says with regard to a conflict of interest, and then various town boards which may have other rules on conflict of interest. So if this is the guiding body, there may need to be work done on the conflict of interest section in the charter, which then would flow down to other departments in town, other boards in town. And then section 10 is limits on the terms of office, where if you're an appointed member of a commission, you can't serve for more than 9 consecutive years or 2 consecutive terms, whichever is longer. So term limits certainly is an item to be discussed. So that is the department, so to speak, of town, of the government of town. Then Article 3 jumps to the powers of the people. And in large part, this section is the check and balance, where the people many times can either bring initiatives or reconsider or make or ask for referendums of decisions made by boards. So that's a bit of a check and balance that has been built in by the prior drafters of the Brattleboro Charter. I'm sorry, I didn't look out here. Did any of you have questions so far? If you walked in late, what I'm trying to do is just do an overview of everything, and Mr. Gartenstein said interrupt at any time, so I'm absolutely fine with that. Section 2 is the power of the people to petition to include articles for to reflect public sentiment or to be advisory to the town. And as it stands right now, it's 5% of the voters, and if it's going to be by Australian ballot, you have to state that it's going to be Australian ballot. And if it's silent as to be being voted upon by the voters of the town, which I'd use the word voters at large. If it's silent as to that, then it's acted upon by representative town meeting. So petitioners generally will say, we wish to have this voted upon by the voters at large by Australian ballot, if they want it to be on the first Tuesday in March. Otherwise, they can ask it to be on the representative town meeting, part of the warning for the representatives to advise on. Right now, you can ask for an article that goes about to any topic that you want. Section 5 there says, no petition shall be rejected for inclusion in the warning for any reason other than insufficient signatures. There is case law in Vermont that says that select boards can deny certain petitions that come before the select board for asking to be on a town meeting warning if it's not germane to the functions of government. So it's not doing the business of the town. Select boards are authorized by various Supreme Court cases to say, sorry, we're not going to put that on the town meeting warning. In Brattleboro, we had a lawsuit brought against the town, which went up to court. And the court said because we had that language in here, Brattleboro could not reject even pretty far afield type petitions. So if you had a petition that said, you know, shall we recolor the sky and always call it, you know, pink versus blue, if you had 5% who brought that, that's got to go on the town meeting warrant. That's up for discussion. From my perspective, I think there should be some limits there. But for right now, because of that section 5 and because of the court, the precedent, if there's 5% for an advisory vote, then we have the advisory vote. Okay. The theory there being, if it's so far afield, you're probably not going to get the 5% of these voters for signatures. Next, and Article 3, Section 2B is the ability for the voters to petition to have an article to adopt an ordinance. Brattleboro, I believe, is the only town in Vermont that takes the ability to create an ordinance to the people. Under state statute, it is the select board that has the sole authority to craft and pass an ordinance. Now, under under state statute, the voters of a town have the right to seek a referendum. It has to be done within 44 days after a select board passes an ordinance, to seek a townwide vote to disapprove of the town's passage of an ordinance. So for instance, 15, 20 years ago, Wilmington passed an anti-nudity ordinance with respect to the ledges on Harriman Reservoir. A petition was brought, it went to a town vote, the town voted to say we're disapproving of that ordinance. It essentially erases the ordinance in full. So that is the statute's way of a check and balance on the power of the select board to create an ordinance. Okay? In Brattleboro, it was determined by the drafters of the original charter and representative town meeting to give that power with a 10% of the voters by petition to say, here's an ordinance, we as the people feel strongly that you should adopt this ordinance, and if you get the 10% of the voters, that ordinance goes to a vote. Okay, so that's, I'm trying to point out some of these things which are unique to Brattleboro. C, you can bring a petition to bring a vote of a proposed amendment to the town plan, zoning, or subdivision. And that requires also 10%. Section 3 goes into petitions for reconsideration of town meeting ordinances adopted by the select board. And that, if you're going to reconsider, carries with it a much higher requirement for obtaining signatures on petitions. So that requires a 20% of the voters to place the language of the petition for reconsideration on a warning. Okay?
I have a question,
Yep.
Bob. There's nothing in here about some type of referendum or other general action by the voters or people in town to include something that has budgetary effects on the select board or town meeting, or I've often wondered that a lot of the things that come up are advisory only. What if they had a dollar amount attached to them that the town is supposed to spend on whatever is in the in that referendum or other action. Is there any, nothing, there's nothing in here that I see that mentions the budget at all.
Yeah, there is the ability, and it's in the addendum A, to seek a referendum of decisions made at representative town meeting. So at representative town meeting, you're voting on the budget. If the voters wish to take that to the voters at large, because there's some topic or some vote on elements of the budget, they have the ability to do that and defeat the budget. As far as individual items, to bring a petition, you raise a good point, because in other towns you can, and by statute, you're entitled to bring a petition to with 5% of the registered voters to place an article on the town meeting warning. And those could be for monetary items and not be just advisory. So I do think we should add a section in for that. That's a little different than adopting an ordinance.
Right.
So we should make a note to talk about that. That's a very good point. Because other towns, so in other towns, if you wanted to do a petition to raise and appropriate $10,000 for, to give to a local volunteer fire department, if the select board doesn't put that on by its own motion, you could petition to have such an article on, and it would be binding. So we should address that. Before I forget, I'm going to write a note. Okay. Thank you. Under section 4, the voters of the town can petition for a referendum to go to a vote by Australian ballot of all the voters of the town on a final vote of representative town meeting. This same section is also in addendum A. And it's got to be filed within 10 days of the representative town meeting, and it has to have at least 5% of the voters or a petition signed by at least 50 representative town meeting members. That is a change from prior charters where you had to have before this change, there were 250 voters and certain numbers from each district, but it got changed just to 5% or a straight 50 representative town meeting members. And then section 5, which is rarely used, and I can't recall a time, but the voters do have the ability to recall elected town officials, and that requires a petition with 25% to take that to a vote. Okay. Again, that is unique to the town of Brattleboro, because in most towns, your elected officials, if they're elected, the check and balance on that is don't elect them next time. But sometimes you're waiting their term, which can be many times 3 years before you get that opportunity. Yes, Peter?
The reference here to the 25% of the signatures having to be gathered within 15 calendar days of its issue sounds to me unique to this section as compared to all the other places where you go out and get signatures.
Yeah.
Well, except reconsideration, there's also a
There's a deadline
from the action taken, but
this seems to be the petition. We should be consistent. Thank you. We should be consistent on that. Likewise, we should have a time limit on how long petition signatures are valid. There's some argument out there that they're valid for many, many years, and I myself don't buy that, but that's something to consider too. Any questions at this point? So, Article 4 gets into the select board, and as far as how it's elected, the staggered terms, the compensation is fixed by a representative town meeting. Every year there's an article with respect to the compensation. There are various prohibitions as to conflicts of who can be a select board member or conflicts between offices. And again, we should compare that to the list of incompatible offices set forth by statute. Just making a note of that, because that list has changed from time to time. Talks about how vacancies are filled, and then the appointments that the select board makes. And in the first instance, it elects a chair, vice chair, and a clerk. And then the select board, of course, with our town manager form of government, appoints the town manager. The select board appoints the town attorney, subject to the ratification by town meeting. And then the select board appoints a long list of various officials of the town, from fence viewers, pound keepers, energy coordinator. And again, we should take a look at that list to see whether there are items on that list that could be eliminated and whether there are new officials to add to that list. Okay? But those are all the power of the select board to make those appointments. All right? The select board has the authority to abolish and create new offices, committees. It does that from time to time. And then at least every 15 years, you get yourself a charter review commission. Okay? We may want to define, because over time there's been different arguments as to when you measure the at least every 15 years. Is it from appointment to appointment, or is it from the end of, the end result of your work, then 15 years? So we may want to make that clear, because we've had that discussion over the last three or 4 years. Then section 6 goes through a very long list of the select board duties. This is in great contrast to the state statute, which has a section on select board duties, which is about yay big. And in the state statute, it says you're, as a select board, in charge of the general affairs of the town. It's quite broad. There are other statutes that fill in the details, but the actual section in the statute is very broad. The charter tries to go into as much detail as possible, from maintaining the various different departments, police, fire, ambulance, health services, you name it, all the way down to the select board's ability to pass ordinances, regulations, those types of things. And we can go over that for purposes of the Charter Review Commission. The state of Vermont is what's called a Dillon's Rule state. So the select board only has the power granted to it by the legislature, which is compared to a home rule state where local governments have all the power except that which is preempted or taken by the state. So, for instance, unless the town just can't pass a gas tax because the legislature hasn't given the town the authority to do such a gas tax. The state did a while back, give towns the ability to do a 1% local option tax for meals and rooms, and sales tax, those sorts of things. But there had been the desire to do that by various towns, but until the state passed the statute enabling the towns to do that, the towns don't have the authority to do that. And one thing that had been presented to the legislature, and Peter can probably fill us in more, but there's the notion out there that if something goes up to the state legislature on a charter change for any town, if the state is enabling that town to do that, there should be the ability of other towns to say, okay, we want to do the same thing and not have to go through such a long process of charter amendment to be able to do the same thing, because what makes one town different than another? And I don't think that got...
It didn't get approved by the legislature, and it's something I do want to talk about when we get to talking about how we're going to do our work. I think there's a way that we, for Brattleboro's benefit, can sort of accomplish the same intent, but by doing it ourselves as opposed to having it become a blanket rule that it would apply to all municipalities. We can talk about that once we're working on it.
So the next article deals with the general powers, duties of the town manager, and that is virtually identical to the powers outlined for town managers by state statute. And again, it'll be up to your commission as to the different forms of government, but if you wish to maintain town manager form of government, that section is likely not to change dramatically because it's so tied to the state statute on town managers. Article 6 deals with the school directors. Again, that probably would need to come out entirely unless you come up with some language that that automatically resurrects school board authority in the event that other state statutes are changed or eliminated in the future. So it'd be an automatic coming in. I say resurrection, maybe that's not the right word, but coming into play. Or it can just be eliminated because if they're going to change the state statutes on school districts in the future, you're not going to be left out of that because schools are schools and education is required for youngsters. So it's not going to be omitted.
So if theoretically we got out every reference to it, then if it did come back later, then there's nothing contradicting it as well.
That's right, yeah. So.
Can I ask one question too about that? We recently had the issue when there was a vacancy on the district school board where it was a Brattleboro person, but of course we're elected at large.
Mm-hmm.
But they had to come to the select board.
Yeah.
But that's a state statute.
That's a state
issue.
statute.
Okay.
And I read that and reread that, and I must say, I really think that the legislature should amend that again to not have to come for a recommendation to a town select board. And it used to be when the old law with school board vacancies is that the select board made the appointment with the advice of the remaining school board members. That seemed entirely, what gives a select board the authority or the knowledge to know more than what the remaining school board members knew. So what you're talking about is in the state statute on how vacancies are filled, and it depends on whether you're an at-large district or forgetting the other term for it. But
So we should get someone to pass on a message to one of our legislators to clarify that for us.
yeah. Well,
You got that, Peter?
yeah. It's really quite confusing. And there was a lot of controversy
Yeah.
on it, which amounted to everybody getting all wound up over what really shouldn't be a major issue on it. Okay, Article 7, finances. The select board submits to representative town meeting a list of the capital expenditures for the next 5 years for guidance and information, which is not binding on the select board, but theoretically that goes into what is the capital plan. So the select board comes up with what's the capital plan, and actually it goes out far more than 5 years, and you've got different trucks being replaced on different years, different police cruisers, when different upgrades are being done on new roofs to town buildings. All of that's in the capital plan. I do think that when we look at capital expenditures, and this is in combination with section 2, which is the capital grant review board, which I will confess, I really don't know what that board does. Every year,
I'm on it, and we don't.
John's looking at me like, what do you mean? You're supposed to know this sort of stuff. But you're on it, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I got elected at the last town meeting, but we've never met.
Yeah. Every year.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I'm glad.
But my point with regard to sections 1 and 2 of Article 7 is that at the very least, part of your work as a commission should be making what happens with regard to capital expenditures, capital grants, capital projects, should mirror what's happening in reality, is the best way I can put it. And in my view, these two sections don't necessarily reflect what happens in reality. And on the Capital Grants Review Board, it's supposed to be two representatives appointed by the select board, 2 by the school directors, which doesn't exist anymore, and 2 by representative town meeting. And as you say, it hasn't met. So maybe we take that out. Maybe parts of that go to the finance committee, which to me makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
But it's again, trying to highlight issues for your discussion going forward. That would be one, and combine it with finance committee work. So.
I have a, go ahead,
Yes.
Millicent.
Can I just note that the finance committee, that could be, not convenient, but reasonable also, because the finance committee, because the school board is no longer, that committee no longer does school budget, the work is lighter for the finance committee. So taking on something like this, might not be too much.
I'm sure your fellow committee members will be glad they're giving them more work. No, I agree with you. That to me, capital expenditures, if you're not going to have a board that deals just with capital expenditures and grants, capital projects, it seems to me that either we eliminate it or you put it in with finance committee.
Yeah, the finance committee already does a section in their report
On capital plan.
plan,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So,
right?
yes.
So in section B of, or paragraph B of section 1, no capital expenditure by the town shall be made or submitted for action at representative town meeting without prior consideration of the select board. It almost implies that a non-capital expenditure could be considered at town meeting without prior consideration by the select board. How would that happen? And, this somewhat relates to the question I was asking earlier about a referendum on the budget.
Yeah.
And so there may be some connection there.
I think there needs to be a connection there because in the event of the ability to petition for a monetary article for town meeting, that in most instances bypasses the select board. When a petition comes into a typical town that gets that type of a petition, the select board's duties there are administrative only. You put it on the warning, and then it's on the warning and discussed at town meeting. So I think you're right that this section here implies the ability to do that, but when you go back to the initiative section, it doesn't really say that. So I think we can correct that. As far as any capital expenditure, it's always going to go through the select board, because the select board is the entity that is proposing the budget and also the capital plan for voting at representative town meeting. So those are always going to come to the select board first.
Couldn't somebody put together a petition to spend money on something, you know, to fix a wall or something that we would normally think of as a capital expense and submit that to town meeting?
Well, I think that what we heard before is that the article relating to the powers of the people doesn't include the ability to gather a petition to put an article on the warning, and that would include a finance-related article. So at this time, that appears to originate just from select board.
That's correct, but I think what Franz is saying is perhaps that should be changed.
Right.
So, I mean, but it's an item for discussion, and you have to look
Well,
at it,
I'm
but-
just thinking about situations where people have approached the select board and there's been discussion about whether the select board would put something on or whether people needed to get a petition signed. And I don't believe it ever happened that the select board decided not to put on a request for seveds. But I know in other communities, the folks have had to go out and get petitions signed in order to bring requests for seveds funding on. And I'm assuming, because of the things we've gone over tonight, that has never happened in Brattleboro, but I don't know that it's never happened in Brattleboro. And so it might be another situation where we've got something to wrestle with about, do we make changes to the document to align with that sort of thing happening, or do we support a clearer statement in the document that would prevent that sort of thing from happening? I think there's choices like that all scattered throughout this for us to make.
Any other questions or comments? We're moving on. Okay. Revenue, section 3. The town, when it levies local taxes, you can only levy the taxes that are authorized by the legislature. Those taxes first have to be considered by the select board and then approved at representative town meeting. But that's the typical progression. You do have the ability to have special tax districts. For instance, we have the Downtown Improvement District, we have the Mountain Home Special District out there. So most of that mirrors the authority for different types of financing or tax districts that exist in state statute. The references here to Title 24, Chapter 87, there are various other chapters in Title 24 that speak to taxing ability or tax increment financing, special assessment districts, you name it. So again, that goes to whether you want to add all that in to a revenue section, or do you want to make reference to state statute with the ability to take advantage of those abilities. We have the Office of Assessment, which used to be called the Lister's Office, but it is the Office of Assessment now, and that office deals with the valuation of town property and the grand list, the revaluations. For instance, this year there's an article on whether to do a townwide reappraisal. So that goes through duties and authorities of that office. And any questions on that? That's really one of the departments in town. Section 5 deals with when you have an appropriation, it lapses the following year. if it has not been expended. And so if you have items in the budget and they're not expended by the end of the fiscal year, that essentially goes into fund balance. The exception to that deals with capital expenditures, and those don't lapse until either the purpose has been accomplished or abandoned, or until 3 years pass without any disbursement on that. And once in a while, we get close to that 3 years with regard to projects that get entwined in permitting, long-term construction, those sorts of things. But generally, we stay clear of that.
What does abandoned mean in that
If you
sentence?
just, it's
Is that an
possible.
official act by somebody to abandon, say this is now abandoned?
Yeah, you could, for instance, have a bond vote to raise, or authorize bonds for a major capital project, and then just say, we're not doing that project. And so you would never really, maybe that's a bad example, because if you never issued the bonds, but they would sit on your books for a while. But if you had a capital expenditure that is in your capital plan, it's probably a better example not to use the bonding, but if it just wasn't done for 3 years, then it lapses. So at that point, you have to have a time when what you're setting aside on the books for a project, if it's not done, that becomes fund balance versus being set aside accounting-wise for that project. That's, I think, the theory behind it.
Okay, this is being a little bit picky, but I get the 3-year part, but the abandonment seems like something separate from that, like there's some process of abandonment. Maybe not, but.
I don't know if there's a process. I think that's primarily the will of the select board. The select board could say, hey, we're just not doing that.
So they just undo what they did.
Yeah. It might be that something else comes up that's a better alternative. It could be a technology change. But again, I think that falls to the direction of the select board. I don't think there's a process for abandoning a project. At least I'm aware of.
What's a sinking fund? In the last sentence?
I bet Peter can answer that question.
I'm sorry, I was making a note.
Yeah. What
What's
is a
a-
sinking fund?
A sinking fund is when you set aside funds in advance. So we haven't been calling it a sinking fund, but the long-range equipment replacement program that Bob was referring to before looks out 25 years, and in that plan there are times where like a police vehicle would be bought with money that's allocated all in 1 year because of its cost, but it's not uncommon that a grader or a dump truck or other large pieces of equipment, actually the best example, so they might be funded over 2 or 3 years in that plan, sorry, my peers. And the best example of that actually...
Fire truck.
The fire trucks, yeah, so we actually did create a sinking fund, a separate fund within that program for funding fire trucks, because all of them require hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so if we were to try to fund a fire truck just in 1 year, the town used to borrow a lot of money to buy equipment like that, because you wouldn't be able to buy anything else in that year when you needed to buy a fire truck. And so now what we do is we set aside a couple $100,000 each year into the fire truck fund, and about every 5 or 6 years we're buying a fire truck. But the money is there because it's been put in advance into the sinking fund.
And I call those reserve funds, and the statute calls those reserve funds. That's why I was a little unclear or unsure of the answer on sinking funds, but given your explanation, Peter, the reserve fund is specifically authorized by state statute. Title 24, 2804, I believe is the statute. And you have to set those up for a particular purpose. So you'll see in other towns a reserve fund for fire truck replacement, a reserve fund for new buildings, you name it. And then each year, towns will put a little bit of money into that, and then when it grows enough to do the project, you can take from that. And it requires a townwide vote to change the purpose of the reserve fund. So if you decided that you had plenty of fire trucks, but you had all that money and you wanted to create a reserve fund for something else, the select board can't simply change the purpose of the fund. It has to be a vote of, in our case, representative town meeting. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you raised the question. I'm glad we drilled down that deep, because there's quite a few places in this document where we use arcane language, that might have been, several charters ago that it got in, and then it just has stayed in. Sinking fund is terminology that means what I said it means, but hasn't really been commonly used for quite a long time, and the statute, provides the guidance on that about reserve funds. I think those are the kinds of things that we would like your help in catching and updating.
Words like surplus and fund balance,
Right.
is another example of that. So, okay. To finish out finance, there are audits done every year. The select board works for the auditors. There's an auditor report, and just like any other town, and pursuant to state law, the select board has the authority to borrow in anticipation of taxes, to meet its demands. Article 8 deals with the 4 different ways to amend the charter. One way is by recommendation of your committee. The other 3 ways, one is by a statutory process. That's actually in play right now based on a petitioned charter change that's coming to the voters, and that requires various public meetings prior to a vote at large by Australian ballot. That then goes to the legislature. The second way is that the select board can simply come up with a proposed charter change, and if it passes that, then it goes to the voters at large for a vote by Australian ballot. If that passes there, then on to the legislature. The third way is by resolution of the representative town meeting members, and this is one that definitely needs some change, because many resolutions come up at town meeting under other business. And of course, anything under other business is non-binding. So how do you then get a resolution that changes the charter? So the way we've done that in the past, and we've used it for some rather mundane changes, is that it got put on the warning for a resolution to be adopted by town meeting. And then it would need to go to various public meetings, but then be approved at the next representative town meeting. So it's almost a 2-town meeting process to adopt a change that's by resolution of representative town meeting members. That seems very cumbersome to me. It's been done before, but I've always wondered why, for instance, in situations like that, why the select board just didn't say, oh, that's a good idea, adopt it as its own, and take a much more streamlined approach to change that. But again, we can talk about all these as we go forward. Article 9 are just transitional provisions that pretty much don't apply anymore because we have the charter. Addendum A is the workings of the representative town meeting. Now, representative town meeting is authorized, how the select board divides the territory into districts, the election of the town meeting members, and of course the districts recently have changed with the redistricting, and instead of having district 1, 2, and 3, we now have 7, 8, and 9 because they're Wyndham County districts.
I'm sorry, but is there any reason that those numbering systems have to be the same for the state legislative seats and for representative town meeting? Maybe they should be, I don't know, but I was at a meeting at the library a few days ago where there was confusion about that, and it just wasn't clear to me that there was a benefit in forcing everybody in town to use the new numbering system instead of just going with districts 1, 2, and 3 when it only addresses town business.
Am I gonna answer that?
Yes, please.
I'm on the Board of Civil Authority, which had to grapple with this, because the legislature is the one that said you're 7, 8, and 9. Then, of course, everybody knows themselves as 1, 2, and 3. So we had this big, what do we do? So what we decided was to still keep 1, 2, and 3, like your Wyndham 7, District 1, Wyndham 8, District 2, Wyndham 9, District 3. So when anybody, if you ever notice this, when you go to the polls in March, when you go in, you're gonna, you know, because people know, like, you know, at the select board meetings, they get up and go, I'm District 2. But really, they're Wyndham District 8. Well, so I don't know if what I just said makes sense, but we were trying to sit there, we had to do 7, 8, and 9. But we didn't want to just wipe out 1, 2, and 3 because everybody is so used to, I live in 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, well, I mean, that makes sense to me. I don't know if it needs to be reflected in here somewhere.
It probably should, because, again, we want this document to mirror what is really happening and vice versa, so.
It's actually similar to what's happening on the interstate where they have exit numbers and
Yes.
mile
Right.
post numbers
Correct.
instead of just one or the other.
For the same reason, because a higher level of government said you have to do it with the mile numbers.
Well, the kilometers never made it. Remember back 40 years ago, it was
Don't
all
go there.
miles and kilometers, and that didn't survive here. So it goes through nominations, filling of vacancies, voting, all of that. You probably want, or I say we, but your commission will probably want to just spend some time on this whole addendum. And I would think that the main person to have at that meeting would be Hillary Francis, because she's the one that is always dealing with the how many are in each district and how many need to be elected, how many need to be appointed through the caucuses, those sorts of things. So she would be probably your best person to have that discussion.
But it does appear that this entire addendum A is just the statute from 1959.
Yes,
So we're not tinkering with that language because that's just the statute.
that's right.
I mean, we want to have Hillary come to speak to all of those issues in the main body of the charter.
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah. The article,
So if we can't do anything with addendum A, because that was one of my questions, can we can put clarifying language in the other section about representative town meeting, right?
We can consider that, I would think,
Yeah.
but it can't be inconsistent with the state statute.
Yeah, because,
well, but you can ask the state statute
Right.
to be changed as part of your charter recommendations, because
oh,
anything here is going to eventually land at the state legislature.
I think actually what we should consider doing to avoid that confusion, there's reference to representative town meeting earlier, and then all this detail here that is from 1959. I think that whether we decide, hey, this is just fine the way it is, or whether we decide there need to be changes, I think based on the experience over these last several years, we're likely to want to make at least some changes to representative town meeting. And if we do, or when we're done with making those decisions, I think the best solution would be to incorporate all of it, and all of what we settle on into the charter document, and no longer have an addendum that
oh,
dates all the way back to 1959. It just creates confusion.
Yes.
I agree with that. I think if you're going to do that, it should go into Article 2, which is organization of town government, because then you're outlining, you have the voters who elect the representatives, you have the voters who elect your select board. Select board makes these appointments, and then you get into select board duties, town manager duties. So it's a kind of a flow chart. You could create a flow chart from the language of your charter. Of note in the addendum, section 7 is important insofar as it states that if you have election of officers and referenda that are required to be by Australian ballot, they're acted upon by the voters of the town, or voters at large, or voters of the town is defined here. Everything else goes to the representative town meeting, and that includes bond votes. Bond votes by statute are required to be voted upon by Australian ballot, so the prior drafters of this document decided that if you're having a representative form of town government, that bond votes should first be voted upon by the representatives and not go directly to an Australian ballot of the voters. Now, if the voters felt strongly about a bond vote, and this has happened in the past, then they have the ability to seek a referendum pursuant to section 8, which also, this is one where there is the conflict between section 4 of article 5 on referendum and section 8 of the addendum. Those, see, the addendum here still has the 250 voters of the town, and including at least 50 from each district. That's an instance of conflict between the addendum and the main charter, and then you go to that tiebreaker in the main charter that says if there's a conflict, the main charter prevails. That's a good example of that. But again, we should try to get rid of those conflicts. Then jumping down to addendum B goes to the rules of procedure, and vote this. We always have a little bit of debate on this because these are the rules that have been adopted by the town and are in the charter for representative town meeting. And voting is by standing, by division, or by roll call. And so in the past, sometimes, you know, you might get lazy and say all in favor, say aye, but that's not in accordance with the rules. And I always think it's good to have the standing vote, keeps everybody awake during the day. And but the other item to keep in mind with regard to the rules and procedures is whether or not you want to make a reference to Robert's Rules of Order, because for the general default is Robert's Rules of Order, but that's not necessarily codified in here. The basis of that comes from the state statute on the town moderator. And the moderator section in the state statute talks about Robert's Rules of Order or such other rules as may be adopted. And you could get into a whole huge debate that would take longer than your meeting sometimes as to which rules to apply. So the rules, your basic rules of parliamentary procedure should be an item that you have some discussion on as you move forward. And then addendum C is a description of all of the boards, commissions, committees. I think there are some that we will want to add, and there are some that we may want to amend, and there may be some that need to be eliminated. And then the glossary, I think, is one of the last exercises where we can do word checks, and that'll be easy to highlight that through word processing to make sure that we have definitions that match and are not in conflict. So that can be a housekeeping item towards the end. So I am happy to answer any questions as we move forward. If there are particular areas in here that you want me to do research on, I'm happy to do that. But that is that's the constitution of the town of Brattleboro right there. That's how currently businesses, government is run. And so now it's up to you as to whether you like that form of government? If it works, how can it be made better? Or are there other forms of government you want to consider? That's why every 15 years, people like you are sitting in your seats. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So the next item on the agenda is follow-up discussion. I think that we probably should have a general discussion now about how we want to move on to our next, which is really going to be an organizational meeting. And I've set out a couple of general subject matter areas that could be organizing principles for the next agenda. But I'd like to also make sure that everybody has an opportunity to weigh in on that, on where we should be going from here. And that's why I left that next item as just follow-up discussion. So I don't know if individual members now want to speak to how they would like to see the next meeting, which again, I consider to be an organizational meeting, structured. I've tried to map that out a little bit, but I'd like to hear from anybody else who's got any ideas about that before weighing in. So if anybody's got any input about that, this would be a good time. Or any other topic that we want to address now in follow-up discussion. Recognizing that we're going to try to limit our meetings to an hour and a half as a general matter, so that we're not doing 3 and 4 and 6 hour meetings. All right. Does anybody have any comment or any input, suggestions about how we would move forward to organizing our activities? Good, Kate.
Well, I'm gonna sound like I'm saying something backwards, and maybe I'm not answering your question, but we kind of figure out, we need to know what our activities are before we can organize them. Do you know what I mean?
Right, I agree with that. The things that I've listed, I'll just start since no one else is jumping in. It seems that there is going to be individual member input into priorities and structure of the charter itself, because town attorney has now spoken and given his overview of the things he thinks are priorities. But I would think each of us would, should take a deep dive into the document and come up with anything that you want to see addressed. All right, so that would be number one. And the second general subject matter area, it seems to me, is developing a process for gathering and reviewing public input. And that's also a matter of soliciting actively from members of the public what they have to say, because we haven't generated a lot of publicity thus far. We've had 3 people sitting with us last meeting and 3 people sitting this meeting. One of them is the same. But we thank the 2 new people who arrived even in the sleep. But it seems that we want to develop a process for how we're going to make this as public spectacle, as public a process as possible. It seems that we also want to look from a different perspective in reviewing each of the individual charter sections. And we might consider breaking those down into chunks that different members of the commission might be taking, not necessarily responsibility for, but leading parts of that discussion. Because part of what I'd like to see happen is that, part of this process is also building capacity. And there's some of us who've been deeply involved in town government before, and others of us who haven't. And I think it might be good if we can break those down into chunks. And if people are interested in leading parts of those discussions, seeing if that's a process that we can develop and work through. Bob has talked a lot of times about if you like this form of government. So really, a fourth sort of topic is how do we address the overall structure of the charter and the overall structure of the town government. And then it seems a separate topic is how to inventory, track, and address all the individual issues that need to be addressed. So I'm talking both the most global approach to the charter, taking individual chunks of the charter, and then also trying to track through all the individual issues to be addressed over time. And I know that Peter had a interest in looking at other charters and comparing what we have with theirs to see if there are ideas and structures that we might consider adopting or learning from. Similarly, I'd like to get a better sense of the history of this charter. And so one thing I would ask, I know Maya asked for the town plan at least to be available as a resource document. I'd like to see if we can't go back and get some of the historical charters so we know how this charter came to be as it is, without trying not to editorialize. I have questions about why this document is as it currently is structured. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, given the way town government functions. It really seems to me that Article 4, the powers of the select board, is really the core of how the town government operates. And we instead start with a power of the people section that says any non-frivolous, non-binding issue can be put to the voters. And I don't understand why we'd be starting a town charter that way. So I'd like to understand historically where we got here. So that's looking at other charters and the history of this charter as well. So those are like 6 different subject matter areas where I thought we could at least begin by organizing our work. What I would at least suggest for now is that we build the agenda around those 6 items, unless there are other thoughts that people have.
The one thing I want to add to your, sort of the history of this document is you know, seeing as this is the only town that does a representative town meeting, understanding a little bit more about the purpose and intent behind enacting that as a system instead of doing what every other town in the state does.
We'll make sure that that's on the next agenda as well. I think there's a lot of anecdotal information about the political forces that were at play in the late 50s when that change was made. I bet Kate could speak to it very well. Peter can probably.
Not that I was alive back then.
But and you know, I mean, there's none of us who are aware of it. And Bob,
unfortunately, many of the, like Bob Gannett,
Right.
who drafted much of it, is no longer with us. He would have been a perfect person to get a lot of that history, as with the 2 of your fathers.
Exactly, that's what I was speaking to.
But I
Right.
think one other person that may be helpful there is Bob Pooh, who was former town attorney back when they did a lot of the amendments in the 80s. And I think he may have a lot of that historical context. And I think we can find either in the Historical Society or at the library or even in statutes the history there.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm happy to ask, since I'm on the library board, I can ask the library if they can help us. Just, you know, get some of the articles, and if that would help too for everybody.
And so I don't know if anybody's, Maya, go ahead.
I have a neighbor who was on the commission in 1984. And I might be able to convince her to come and talk to us.
Excellent.
I don't know, she's kind of reticent these days, but
Maybe you can just find out what she knows and tell us.
yeah, I could do that.
Right. So if anybody's got any other ideas now, thank you. And yeah, please go
And
ahead.
this is something I don't think we're gonna know the answer to till we figure this out. But sometime I think we have to figure out how long we wanna take. You know, the last one was years and years and years. So I don't think we wanna take years and years and years.
No. That's great. And we'll be developing an agenda sometime in the next week. What's the next meeting on the 9th maybe, or the 19th?
The ninth.
And just.
2/9 is the next meeting, and so
I
Kate.
will not be at that
Right.
meeting.
Good.
I said that
Well,
last
this year.
time, but you got plenty of other things. But on that historical part, I can perhaps look into that as well, and then give you something or relay it to somebody.
Right, and if the library or the town manager's office can just work together some of the historical versions of the charter so we can look at them. If there's any other input about the agenda, you can direct it to me. And Kate and I will talk beforehand in order to set the agenda. Peter, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to make sure I understand what you've described. It sounds good to me. I do think that you've captured sort of the 6 major points of consideration as we organize our work. But as you were looking ahead to the next time, and as we together prepare for next time, it's been my understanding, I want to make sure that it's true, that we'll work with this that you just talked about, plus other ideas that we bring into that discussion, strictly about organizing the work.
Yep.
And so, one of the reasons why it's not a problem for Bob not to be there is we're not going to actually dive into these topics. We're going to organize how we're going to go about diving into the topics. And if that's so, then I want to make sure that we prepare ourselves in thinking about it that way. I know, to varying degrees, some of us have ideas about specific sections, and it'll be challenging not to slip into those. But I think it's important that you're raising how to really be systematic about our work and how to be transparent to the public about how we're being systematic about our work.
I think that the one comment I have about that is that the first item, the first topic that I had about individual commission member input about subject matter areas, I think it's probably useful after everybody's had a chance with Bob's overview to think about the charter as a whole, to at least, if they want to, be able to provide some input about general principles and thoughts that are substantive in nature. Because that will help us to get an idea about the types of issues that any of us are interested in dealing with the charter going forward. But I don't think, other than highlighting those issues, we would be anticipating having any decision-making or substantive discussion about them. But having individual people have the opportunity now at the 3rd meeting to say, these are the various things that we'd like to see dealt with substantively, and these are my questions. So that's the one exception to that, because it's really a substantive discussion at the front end. Any other comments about organizational matters about how we would move forward? All right, so I would just invite anybody who's got anything that they think about after to let me know, because Kate and I will confer about putting together an agenda next week, and we'll try to structure my thoughts into something that makes sense, and then if there's anything else, we can add that. Is there any other discussion for tonight's meeting? We'll take a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion's adjourned, meeting's adjourned at 7:25. Thanks, everybody.